Hello all, welcome to the final session on the critique of subaltern studies. So, in the last class we have dealt with the critique of subaltern studies presented by Javed Alam in the immediate aftermath of the publishing of the first volume of subaltern studies in 1982 and 1983. Javed Alam's critique came soon after that, and we have looked at how Javed Alam made an elaborate critique or conceptual critique of the idea of subaltern autonomy, as well as the problem of what he calls a conceptual eclecticism in subaltern studies. So, in this session we will look at two more critique of subaltern studies. The first is by Sumit Sarkar, who was the part of the founding team of subaltern studies, right? And later he has left the collective, and he has written an article titled The Decline of Subaltern in Subaltern Studies. This was published in 1997. It was earlier published as an article and later included in his book Writing Social History. So, in this particular, this is very important because this is an inside critique of subaltern studies. It is a critique that comes from a very important founding scholar of subaltern studies, who was later descended from it. And he is also a historian. Sumit Sarkar, he was a professor of history for a long time in University of Delhi, and he has made very important critique, very important scholarship on colonial India. One of his book titled as Modern India is a classic that I strongly recommend all of you to read, to understand to have a very comprehensive view of the social history of India during the colonial period until India's attainment of freedom in 1947. We will look at this article in detail. So, basically he says subaltern. So, basically as the title of this essay says, the decline of subaltern in subaltern studies. Basically this the crux of critique has to deal with the trajectory that subaltern studies took. So, unlike Javed Alam, he has no issue with this idea of subaltern autonomy alone, right? He agreed with it, that's why he was part of the collective, but he has an issue with the way that subaltern studies collective has taken, the direction it took in the subsequent years. We will just look at what are the major crux of Sumit Sarkar's critique, and then we will go in detail. The first critique, which is very obvious from the title, is there is a decline of focus on the subaltern studies, subaltern studies. There is the latest subaltern studies volume has not paid enough attention to underprivileged. The idea of peasantry has completely disappeared. The idea of working class, Dalits and tribes has declined, and the focus has been more on the idea of community as a valorized category, right? Community is now ambiguous, a very heterogeneous category, replaced this focus on the actual subalterns who are underprivileged, such as the peasantry, working class, Dalits and tribes. So, which he calls the decline of subaltern in subaltern studies. And he also goes into the problem of that caused by an increased attention by the Western scholarship on subaltern studies. He will go into that in detail. So, first he reminds the reader about the context of the formation of subaltern studies, because this context is very important to go into the later critique by Sumit Sarkar. So, Sumit Sarkar reminds the reader that subaltern studies emerged as a critique, as a movement within Marxist historiography. It has simultaneously made critique of the mainstream national imperialist as well as the orthodox Marxist historiography, but its conceptual apparatus remained within the broad Marxist and socialist horizon, right? So, it reminds that subaltern studies is a movement within Marxism, but a greater attention, a greater greater sense of the what constitute difference in post-colonial context, right? How Marxism or the Marxist analysis should be sensitive to the kind of different structures of the global south. So, it's a Marxism with a difference. That's what Sumit Sarkar says. As well as it was immediately inspired by the work of Antonio Gramsci, who was generally seen as making a very important contribution within the Marxist framework by focusing the non-economical structures, right? In Marxism, there is this broad division of the base and the superstructure. The base constituted by economic activities, production relations, modes of production, and so on, and the superstructure by which focus on culture, politics, and so on. And conventional Marxism seems to have only focused on the base, but Gramsci made a very decisive contribution by looking at how the superstructure, what is being hitherto called as the superstructure, has a very important influence on the base, thereby preempts even the division of the base and the superstructure, right? So Gramsci's work has inspired a host of Marxist scholarship to look beyond economic reductionist understanding and look at not just dominance but also hegemony, right? How the bourgeois elite or the bourgeoisie were able to manipulate or able to create a consent for capitalism among the working class, right? That's what he called as hegemony. Hegemony is a combination of coercion as well as consent, right? And he also provoked Marxist thinkers to look at not just the realm of political society but also the realm of civil society where actual consent has been created, right? The domains of voluntary association, the space between the family and the state, where a whole lot of activities takes place. But Gramsci also asked us to look at the realm of civil society, for example, the realm of schools, education, for instance. How does the consent for a system, an exploitative system, is generated in the domains of civil society? So this move has certainly influenced the subaltern studies. Another immediate schools of historiography is from the British school of Marxism, primarily by historians like E.P. Thompson as well as other Marxists like Erich Hobsbawm to a limited level, who has been writing history from below, right? Even the Marxist historians before Thompson has focused on history from, looked at larger structural thing, who has also treated peasantry or working class as mere objects of history or objects of history of capitalism or larger structures. But E.P. Thompson then had adopted an approach of history from below, where you look at the social history of the peasantry or the working class from their own subjective experiences, right? And these two, the Gramscian and the Thompsonian movement within the Marxists, inspire the subaltern studies to recover the neglected aspect of popular or subaltern autonomy in action, consciousness, and in culture, primarily in the colonial period. And unlike Javed Alam, Sumit Sarkar argues that the earlier volumes of subaltern studies was an empirical substantiation of or empirical valid or demonstrated the empirical validity of this hypothesis of subaltern autonomy. So this is the difference that he has with Javed Alam. But then he says eventually what happened with the subaltern studies is that this distinction between elite and subaltern became essentialized and a stark distinction emerged between them. Then what he calls as a bifurcation of the worlds of the domination and autonomy. So subaltern autonomy in the original sense, according to Sumit Sarkar, was not completely insensitive to the problem of domination or never seen as stark distinction. They were never seen as completely separate. Obviously, the autonomy is a very important category, but they also were sensitive to how this autonomy is being influenced by the domain, the domination of the elite domain of power. And Sumit Sarkar says, over the years, he also demonstrate particular scholarship within the subaltern studies, such as that of Gyan Prakash, who came into subaltern studies in the late 1980s or early 1990s, who Sumit Sarkar has no regard for this earlier foundational movements such as the history from below or the Gramscian projects. He says, as such scholars has been added to the subaltern studies, the idea of the idea of domination and autonomy has been completely separate. And he says, if one has to see domination and autonomy in two separate spheres, then one has to see that domination is irresistible, right? If domination takes place as a separate activity, which does not affect or does not influence the peasant consciousness at all, then resistance is impossible, right? And he says this led to an essentialization of the categories of subaltern and autonomy. So, as you can see, this is very close to what Jawaharlal says, but the difference is that Sumit Sarkar says this problem of essentialization was not there in the initial scholarship, but was a later addition, a consequence of the later addition, and says, and he says what happens in the process is that the Subaltern Studies scholarship has completely missed out the dialectics, the kind of relation, dialectics is a very important methodological approach within the Marxism, which looks at the relation between two opposing forces, right? So, in the conventional Marxist schema, every mode of production is constituted by two opposing forces, right? In the context of capitalism, it is the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and there is a relation between them. So, history moves by the relation, the dialectical relation between these two opposing forces, right? But so in the Subaltern Studies schema, Sumit Sarkar says once these categories are being seen as separate essential categories, then there is no possibility of paying attention to the relation between them, which he calls as a loss of dialectics between them, which also very close to Jawaharlal's critique. And the other critique, which the other critique that Sumit Sarkar says is, as a consequence of all this, there is a shift in the meaning of who constituted subaltern, right? He then went on to say that the later Subaltern Studies scholarship has completely laid out by the initial frame. So, there is a 6-point methodological criteria that Guha draws directly from Gramsci, which I am not going into details. You can find that in Sumit Sarkar articles. He says such that all this criteria has been violated in the later subaltern historiography. So, subaltern, so in the Gramscian schema, both the subaltern as well as the elite has the same social origins in the same social formation. They are not completely separate, right? So, you have to remember Jawaharlal here that the subalterns are not already autonomous, they are in search of autonomy, right? But in the later Subaltern Studies schema, they has been treated as if subalterns or the elites belong to different social formation. So, that is why subalterns have been, there is an attempt to look for subalterns in pre-colonial communities untouched by power, untouched by the power of the elite, right. So, there is a search for subaltern, so this is also very similar to what Jawaharlal reminded us of. So, this is a consequence of the bifurcation of the category of elite and subaltern, autonomy and domination. And as a consequence, Sumit Sarkar says new conceptual binaries has been created. Instead of elite versus subaltern, now the dominant binary in Subaltern Studies by early 1990s is the binary between colonial cultural domination versus indigenous community, right, and without any internal attention to internal tensions and conflicts. And he specifically explores the works of Partha Chatterjee as an important figure in Subaltern Studies right from the beginning to the later stage, and Partha Chatterjee in different of his work has introduced several positions such as derivative discourse. For example, his book Nationalist Thought and Colonial World, a derivative discourse, and on his later book Nation and His Fragments. So, these, instead of paying attention to subaltern themselves, ideas like derivative discourse or indigenous communities and fragments became the major theoretical presuppositions or obsessions of Subaltern Studies. So, this is what Sumit Sarkar says, and he further says there is a shift in the central problem. While the earlier subaltern scholarship looked at how the existing scholars or historiography failed to look at the contribution of subaltern people in the nation building, now the focus is on the failure or the process of nation building itself, even by the elite or subaltern. So, there is a complete absence of subaltern in Subaltern Studies. And he says by the later 1990s, Gandhi emerged as a principal focus of the Subaltern Studies collective. So, who is Gandhi? Gandhi is not a subaltern himself in the original sense of the term subaltern, right? He is a Bania who is a mainstream national leader, who is the symbol of the mainstream anti-colonial national movement, who was a central figure in the colonial in the social and political contestations in colonial India, and he became the central focus of the subaltern studies. So that is a paradox that Sumit Sarkar highlight. And he then says the later subaltern studies, the recent works, even incorporated figures like Ashish Nandi. So those who are familiar with Ashish Nandi would know that he can be characterized as a scholar who comes from a critical traditionalist position, who present a very comprehensive critique of everything that is identified with the project of modernity, right? Be secularism, capitalism, or nationalism in itself. So Ashish Nandi would say that the modern project of secularism is a synonym with domination, and for modes of coexistence we should look at pre-colonial traditions such as religious pluralism that is untouched by the modern project of secularism. He says Ashish Nandi cannot be called as an anti-capitalist alone, he cannot be called as an anti-colonialist, but he is more of an anti-modernist. So he has a problem with everything modern. So people like Ashish Nandi became acceptable to subaltern studies, and so that is a kind of convergence or the deviation that subaltern studies took in Sumit Sarkar's position. Subaltern studies, from being a dissenting voice within Marxism, has become an anti-modernist project in itself. That is a kind of, so that's where people like Ashish Nandi has been welcomed or being made alliances with subaltern studies scholarship. And he says there are two reasons, there are two misrecognitions that needs to be looked at on the later trajectory of subaltern studies. He says the later subaltern studies has fallen back to conventional forms of historiography. He refers to Parth Chatterjee's book Nationalist Thought and Colonial Derivative, where Chatterjee essentially argues that the Indian nationalist thinking, such as that of right from Tagore to Nehru, who we think as the most important figures, who has carved out an intellectual source for asserting our nationhood, those figures, even while seen as nationalist thinkers, were essentially drawing their thinking from colonial sources. So their nationalist, the mainstream nationalist thought of the Indian elite was nothing but a derivative of the colonial world, right? Colonial concerns, the framework, and Gandhi has been treated separately. That's a different debate. So he says such historiography where such elite become the central point is a conventional form of historiography that existed in India even before the birth of subaltern studies. So subaltern studies has fallen back to conventional sources of intellectual histories. So there is a complete decline of not just the subjects of subaltern studies, but also its methodological novelty. And now Sumit Sarkar says, as the idea of subaltern has become more broader, early it was very specific to peasantry or underprivileged such as Dalits or tribes. Now it has become everything that has been subjected to Western cultural colonial domination. So everything in India can be called as subaltern in that sense, right? Even middle class in that sense, even minorities, even all kinds of communities has been defined as subalterns, because subaltern now has been treated in opposition to Western colonial cultural domination. Sarkar then points out to a second problem, that after the certain movements within the Western scholarship, especially came after the publishing of Edward Say's Orientalism in 1978, which became very prominent in the 1980s, that there is a certain rethinking or reflection within the Western scholarship that you need to look at more. There's a rethinking about the colonial complexity of European scholarship. So they became more open to the scholarly move that comes from the global south, and subaltern studies, by virtue of being in the same time period, became more attractive to the Western academia, right? And that's why people like Edward Said himself wrote Introduction to Subaltern Studies, and people like Gayatri Spivak then became part of the collective in 1980s and introduced a post-structuralist turn within the subaltern studies, right? the Foucauldian ideas of power became the central tenets by replacing a Gramscian idea subaltern autonomy, right. So, this is a consequence of the Western search for, or Western, it is a result of the Western academia's reflexivity on their own colonial complexity. So, that created an inflated reputation. So, subaltern studies became an attractive school of thought in the Western scholarship, not because of its inherent merit, but because of the circumstantial attraction for such, original thinking, such original movement within the global South. So, this Western attractive has actually reinforced this idea of subaltern as a subject of Western colonial cultural domination. So, what happened? So, subaltern studies from being a move that problematized historiography in India has now grown or deviated to a move or scholarship that problematized Western colonial cultural domination itself, right. So, this is seen in a positive light by many scholars, but so Sumit Sarkar, this actually created a decline on focus of subaltern, the actual subaltern within subaltern studies itself. So, Sumit Sarkar then says it has political consequences as well. So, once the focus has been shifted, there is an actual absence or actual ignorance or actual invisibilization of actual histories of the left and anti-caste movement, which were actually the subaltern movements in India. And he says in 1980s or 1990s, new social movements among the subaltern studies as emerged, subaltern communities as emerged in India, which actually advances the cause of civil liberties and individual rights. If you are familiar, there is Dalit Panther movement inspired from Ambedkarite thought, and there is a lot of civil liberties movement coming from the left in the immediate aftermath of emergency and so on, which became and there is the assertion of the other backward castes for greater constitutional rights in the early 1990s. All these have been happening, but subaltern studies has been continuously silent on this because subaltern studies, because of their positioning as a movement against Western cultural domination, they became increasingly critical of the whole of the Enlightenment project itself, right. So, therefore, they could not actually pay enough attention to this movements that is coming within the subaltern communities and who were actually advancing the idea of feminist ideas, individual rights, because since they actually draws their inspiration from Enlightenment traditions, the subaltern studies were not being attentive because of this shift in the framework, shift in their emphases, and they were all delegitimized as Western Enlightenment projects. Sumit Sarkar then also says that problematize the class location of the subaltern studies scholars themselves, right. None of them hails from so-called subaltern communities, and he also says this idea of this binary combination or the separation of material advancement and spiritual autonomy as two separate spheres. Subaltern studies have a strange overlap with the kind of scholarship that promotes the Hindu nationalist idea, right. Hindu nationalism treat spiritual and materials as two separate spheres, right. Subaltern studies has a strange overlaps with such Hindu nationalist concerns. He then went on to say that this decisive shift of critical register from colonial and capitalist to that of the Western Enlightenment itself has created a vague nostalgia about indigenous identities, right. Communities in subaltern studies then become a search for authentic indigenous communities in the whole of the non-West. So, this is the shift that Sumit Sarkar is talking about. So, he gave an example that Partha Chatterjee in his book Nationalist Thought and Colonial World offers a critique of Nehruvian planning, bureaucratic nationalism as an example of how the Indian national thought is a derivative of the colonial world. But then when the neoliberal turn happened in India in 1990s, there is an abandoning of planning, right, and that has been seen as against subaltern interest. giving more and more space for capitalist interest. But then, and this also happened as a pressure of the Western pressure, like the World Bank and IMF and such economic institutions, right? And then Partha Chatterjee has no take on this. So Sumit Sarkar says, when you posit everything of the nationalist thought or the Indian nationalist project has against the interest of subaltern, what happened is that whenever such institutions like planning board, which actually served for the subaltern interest to great extent, is been abandoned by Western project, subaltern studies has no take or they are completely silent about it. So Sumit Sarkar's take this as a paradox of subaltern studies or the shift in subaltern studies. So finally, we will also discuss another important essay, another important critique of subaltern studies, that is a book length critique of subaltern studies titled Postcardinal Theory and the Spectre of Capital by Vivek Chibber. So as I already mentioned, this was published in 2013, an Indian edition has come out later, which is available in the market as well as on the internet. So basically, I am not going into very detail of this, but many of the critique that Vivek Chibber builds upon the existing critique against subaltern studies by people like Sumit Sarkar and Javed Alam and so on. So I will just highlight one of the distinctive critique that Vivek Chibber presents against subaltern studies. So he says so basically one of the main idea of subaltern studies is that the Indian state during the colonial time as well as during the post-colonial time is a state without hegemony. So in the idea of subaltern studies, the majority of Indian mass who are peasantry has not given their consent for the Indian national project, be it colonial time or being the democratic process. So he says this is a flawed idea. Vivek Chibber says this comes from a flawed historiography of the European sense. So the idea of European capitalism and Indian capitalism, the distinction between them is constitutive of subaltern studies, and Vivek Chibber says that bifurcation between the Western or the European capitalism and Indian capitalism comes from the flawed historiography of the flawed understanding of the historiography of the Europe. So he details that in his chapters. He says that this difference between European and Western and Indian capitalist is largely fictional. So the basic idea that subaltern studies present is that capitalism in the West was successful in building consent across classes and thereby institutionalizing a liberal democratic framework successfully. It's an example of the hegemony of the bourgeoisie. But in Indian context, the bourgeois lacked hegemony, right? They were not able to institutionalize their hegemony because they lacked consent from the domain of the subaltern, which is the largest, the biggest domain in Indian scenario, right? So that is what Guha called the dominance without hegemony, and this happens because of the form of the nature of capitalism in Indian context itself. So this is the crux of the subaltern studies, and he says the subaltern studies. So the idea is that the capitalism in India failed to universalize its features, right? It failed to universalize democracy, it fails to universalize the dominance or the hegemony of the bourgeoisie. So this is the central thesis that the subaltern studies presented, which actually what is being critiqued by Vivek Chibber. Vivek Chibber says the subaltern studies scholars misrecognized what are the universalizing tendency of the capitalism. He says democracy is not an intrinsic universalizing factor of capitalism. So subaltern studies equate the success of democracy as a success of the universalization of capitalism. Vivek Chibber says it is not. He says capitalism universalizes only a particular reproductive relation based on market dependency, right? And he says India is as market dependent as, let's say, Los Angeles or Nairobi or London is. So capitalism in India is successful, it's there, India is as capitalist as the Western world, but the reproduction of peasantry is not a marker of the absence of universalizing of tendencies of the nets of capitalism. So Vivek Chibber accuses the subaltern studies of having has a misunderstanding or a misrecognition of the nature of capitalism in India itself. He says subaltern studies attribute the bourgeoisie a democratic mission that in fact rejected and fought against. He says that the core reason why democracy survives in India is not because the capitalists wants it, because democracy in India is protected and preserved by the subaltern, the so-called subaltern. So if you look at a later book by Javed Alam, titled Who Wants Democracy, he has a book based on the data from the CSDS survey. He actually makes his point: India, democracy as a concept, as an institution, as a value is cherished and preserved not by the elite but by the subaltern. So it is a misattribution of the subaltern studies to say that in India democracy is a system, is primarily a system attributed to capitalist. So if you look at the success of India's democracy, that itself is a rejection of the subaltern studies thesis, that the mass of the Indian population who are the subaltern did not have a faith in the elite project such as democracy. On the other hand, in India, democracy is as a subaltern project as much as is an elite project. And Chibber also says the subaltern studies underestimate capitalism's ability not only tolerate heterogeneity but to actively promote it. So one of the reasons why subaltern studies says capitalism in India is a failed project because it failed to have a hegemony is because peasantry continued to be an important class under Indian capitalism. And Javed and Vivek Chibber says it is not a deviation from the feature of capitalism. Capitalism is incapable of accommodating such different class in itself, right? And he says subaltern studies have a very narrow idea of capitalism. And further, finally, Vivek Chibber says subaltern studies in having such an obscure understanding of capitalism, what in fact it does is a process of resurrecting Orientalism. So Orientalism, as you might be familiar, is an idea that presented by Edward Said, which seen the West and non-West as distinctive categories, and the West or the the Occidental world as necessarily superior to that of the Oriental world, the culture, the institutions and so on, right. So it presupposes an essential difference between the Orient and the Occident, or the West and the non-West. And he says, and Vivek Chibber accuses subaltern studies of in turn resurrecting this distinctive, this constitutive difference between the West and the non-West, or the Occident and the Orientalism. Therefore, he accuses them of resurrecting Orientalism. And he says it is very similar to what Sumit Sarkar says, because Vivek Chibber also agrees with Sumit Sarkar that subaltern studies has shifted from its original emphasis on peasantry in India to that of the binary between the West and the non-West. So the binary between the elite and the subaltern within the Indian context has shifted to the binary between the West and the non-West, right? And the whole of the non-West assumes the position of the subaltern. He says subaltern studies in doing that insist that the Eastern agents operate with an entirely different political psychology or autonomous mental space from that Western agent. So Vivek Chibber then went on to argue that the working class of the peasantry in the West as well as the East has similar political psychology, which is primarily focused on expanding their own respective material interest. I am not going into detail, which is also very similar to what Sumit Sarkar says. Subaltern studies, because of the shift in their framework from a conventional or a different Marxist to that of a larger non-Western post-colonial thing, has went on to valorize the indigenous, valorize the non-West as an exotic subject opposed to which is as a resisting autonomous subject against the Western cultural domination. This is what he calls as a form of resurrecting Orientalism. So if you are interested, there is a very interesting public debate between Vivek Chibber and Partha Chatterjee, one of the most important representative figure of the subaltern studies, and there is an hour-long debate between Partha Chatterjee and Vivek Chibber that is available on YouTube, which can actually summarize his book and the kind of response, the defense the subaltern studies has made. So, if you are interested, there are much more wide array of critique that comes from also from non-Western, let us say feminist and other, from also Dalit standpoint against subaltern studies. So, these are some of the important readings that you can have a look at, and I think this gives a very broad overview of subaltern studies critique. What I presented here in the last 2 sessions is primarily from Marxist critique, because subaltern studies presented itself as a dissenting voice within Marxist school, but as I said, there is a vast array of critical scholarship emerged in the later phase. So, these are some of the readings you can go into. Thank you.